cleaners don't understand art," shouted millionaire CEO Eduardo, owner of the trendiest gallery in São Paulo. He humiliated the cleaner, Clara, for daring to touch the most expensive painting in the exhibition, a work worth 50 million. In front of all the critics, she apologized and pointed out a tiny detail in the signature. The art expert evaluating the piece heard her, ran to the painting, looked through a magnifying glass, and his face turned white. The air in Edward Vance's gallery, in the heart of Chelsea, New York City, vibrated with an almost palpable electricity. Crystal chandeliers poured a golden light onto the polished marble floors, reflecting the glitter of jewelry and the flash of high society photographers' cameras. The sound was a symphony of clinking champagne flutes, restrained laughter, and the murmur of conversations about stock options and trips to the Swiss Alps. Edward, the host, a man whose posture exuded the confidence of a fortune built with audacity on Wall Street, was the conductor of this celebration. He raised his glass, a wide smile on his face, his teeth as white as the gallery walls. In the center of the room, under a directed spotlight, rested the reason for it all, an exceedingly rare painting, a jewel of American abstract expressionism, supposedly a lost Willem de Kooning. The work was the latest and most daring acquisition for his collection, a $50 million investment that, for him, was more than capital. It was the coronation of his status as a man of unquestionable taste and power. Meanwhile, on the fringes of this opulent universe, Clara moved her mop in slow, methodical arcs. The scent of lemon polish mixed with the expensive perfume wafting through the air, a combination that to her was simply the aroma of work. Her blue uniform, impeccably clean but visibly worn, made her a functional shadow, part of the invisible machinery that kept this world shining. She kept her eyes down, focused on her task, ignoring the faces and conversations that didn't belong to her. However, as she approached the red velvet pedestal where the masterpiece was displayed, something made her stop. It wasn't the sheen of the varnish or the painter's fame, but a minuscule detail, almost a visual whisper that screamed in her mind. She looked up, her brown eyes, accustomed to spotting dust in the corners, now fixed on the canvas. She frowned, a crease of unease forming between her eyebrows. The world around her seemed to fall silent. The murmurs about dividends, acquisitions, and the latest crypto surge vanished. There was only her and the painting. Driven by an instinct older and deeper than her cleaning routine, Clara set down her bucket, adjusted her yellow rubber gloves, and drew closer. Each step was hesitant, as if crossing an invisible border. She stopped inches from the work, her heart beating a little faster. Her eyes didn't see the fortune hanging there, but the soul of the brushstroke, an artist's handwriting. And that's when she saw it, the signature, instinctively, like someone touching a family heirloom. She reached out and ran the tip of her gloved finger over the letters in the bottom right corner. A light, almost reverent touch. Edward's reaction was immediate and volcanic. He, who had been boasting to a circle of admirers about his killer instinct for great deals, saw the scene and his face twisted into a mask of fury. "Get your filthy hands off of that!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the hall like a shard of glass. The murmuring ceased instantly. All eyes turned. "Your dirty gloves are touching a masterpiece. What do you know about it? The cleaning staff doesn't understand art. Security, get this woman out of here." Two men in black suits began to move toward her, but Clara didn't back down. She turned, not to Edward, but to the man beside him, a gentleman with white hair and a bewildered expression. The renowned Dr. Arthur Sterling, the country's foremost art expert, there to authenticate the work. "Forgive me, sir," she said, her voice surprisingly steady and clear. "I wasn't smudging it. I was checking." She pointed to the signature, the K in de Kooning. "It's wrong. The internal downstroke is too closed." The real de Kooning used an almost straight line at that angle. Edward let out a cruel laugh. "How ridiculous! Now the janitor is an expert. "Dr. Sterling, tell this idiot she's wrong." But the art expert wasn't laughing. He had gone pale, the blood seeming to drain from his face. He walked slowly, almost in a trance, to the painting. He took a small jeweler's loupe from the inside pocket of his blazer and leaned in to examine the signature. The room held its breath. A minute of tense silence stretched on, heavy as gold. Finally, Dr. Sterling straightened up, his face ashen. He turned to the shocked crowd, his eyes wide. "My God," he whispered, his voice trembling. She's right. Doctor. Sterling's declaration hung in the air, dense and irrefutable. For a moment, the only sound in the opulent hall was the distant hum of the air conditioning. Then, like a dam breaking, the silence gave way to a wave of shocked murmurs. Dozens of smartphones were raised, their screens glowing as guests began to record the scene, eager to capture a titan's fall. Edward's face, once inflated with pride, collapsed. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving a sickly pallor that not even his spray tan could hide. His eyes, once flashing with contempt for Clara, were now glazed over, fixed on the painting that, seconds ago, represented the pinnacle of his fortune and was now the monument to his humiliation. Every dollar of that $50 million investment seemed to have turned to lead, weighing on his shoulders. The business genius, the man with the Midas touch, had bought a fraud. And the person who unmasked him was not a rival on the trading floor, but the woman who cleaned his floors. Dr. Sterling, on the other hand, seemed to have forgotten Edward and the crowd. His eyes, alive with an intellectual curiosity that trumped the scandal, were locked on Clara. He took a step toward her, the small loop still between his fingers. How in the world did you know that?" He repeated the question, his voice now firmer, laden with a genuine respect Clara hadn't felt in decades. She shrugged, the instinctive gesture of someone who has spent a lifetime trying not to take up space. The weight of all those eyes was almost physical, a pressure that made her want to disappear. She gripped the plastic handle of her bucket as if it were an anchor. "My father," she began, her voice low but clear in the renewed silence. "He was a curator at MoMA for 30 years. I grew up among his books and archives. He was obsessed with the forgeries of Julian Croft. I spent my adolescence cataloguing his study notebooks, comparing brushstrokes, the chemical composition of paints, the handwriting." She paused, her eyes lost in a distant memory. "I know that signature better than my own." The simplicity of the explanation was more shocking than any accusation. There was no malice in her voice, only the unvarnished truth. The reporters, smelling the story of the year, began to push forward. "What's your name, ma'am?" one shouted. "How do you feel about this?" asked another. Camera flashes exploded, turning the scene into a cruel spectacle. Clara shrank back, startled, instinctively seeking the shadow of invisibility that had always protected her. She didn't want fame or recognition. She just wanted to finish her shift and catch the last train home. It was then that Edward awoke from his stupor. Humiliation gave way to a cold, cutting rage. He couldn't attack the credibility of Dr. Sterling, the pillar of the nation's art world, but he could destroy the woman who had exposed him. "Enough!" he bellowed, his voice regaining its arrogance. "This is absurd, a setup. This woman was probably paid by a competitor to sabotage my investment and tarnish my name." He pointed a trembling finger at Clara. "Security, I told you to get her out of here. Now!" The two men in suits moved again, this time with more determination. But before they could reach her, Dr. Sterling interposed himself, calmly stepping between them and Clara. "She's not going anywhere," the expert said, his authority silencing the security guards instantly. He turned back to Clara, his face illuminated by an idea. "My dear, the detail you noticed, the angle of the IK, that's something only someone with an encyclopedic knowledge would perceive. Croft changed that minute detail in 1974 after a trip to Florence, didn't he? The question, so specific and academic, caught Clara by surprise. She blinked, her mind sifting through dusty memories. "Yes," she whispered. "It was after he saw Michelangelo's manuscripts. He was fascinated by the way," but she couldn't finish. Edward, completely ignored and enraged at seeing his authority usurped in his own gallery, lunged forward. He stopped inches from Clara's face, the expensive scent of champagne and fury hitting her full force. "Listen here," he hissed, his voice low and full of venom, so that only she and Dr. Sterling could hear. "You can have your 15 minutes of fame, but you will pay for tonight. You have no idea who you're messing with. You will bitterly regret ever opening your mouth." The venom in Edward's words seeped into Clara's skin, colder than the marble beneath her feet. For an instant, fear paralyzed her. She was a woman accustomed to dealing with visible dirt, the kind you remove with soap and water, not the toxicity emanating from this man. His threat wasn't a shout, but a whisper, and for that very reason, 1,000 times more terrifying. She saw in his eyes not just the fury of a multimillionaire whose investment had proven worthless, but the hatred of a predator whose pride had been wounded. The man wasn't just lamenting the loss of money, he was lamenting the crack in his image of infallibility, an image his vast capital had built and polished over the years. He saw his fortune, his reputation, his very being ridiculed before the elite he had worked so hard to dominate. And the fault, in his twisted mind, was entirely hers. Before Clara could even process the threat, Dr. Sterling's calm, commanding voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Vance, I believe that's quite enough," the expert said, his tone making it clear this was not a request, but an order. "This woman has done us all an invaluable service tonight, protecting the integrity of the art market from a colossal error. She deserves respect, not intimidation." Doctor Sterling then turned to the horde of journalists who were advancing like a tide. He raised a hand, and as if by magic, they stopped. "The real story here is not a mistake, but a revelation," he declared, his voice projecting with the authority of decades of experience. "The discovery of profound knowledge where it is least expected. I will give a formal statement tomorrow at my office. For now, I ask that you respect this woman's privacy." Edward, seeing control of the situation slip away completely, exploded. "Out, all of you, out of my gallery. The party's over," he yelled at the guests, who, between whispers and sidelong glances, began to disperse, taking with them the story that would be the talk of New York by morning. In a few minutes, the sumptuous hall emptied, leaving a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of sirens in the Manhattan night. In the void of the gallery, under the cold light of the security spots, only the three of them remained. Clara, still trembling, clutched her bucket like a shield. Edward, his back to them, stared at his false masterpiece with impotent fury. And Dr. Sterling, who approached Clara with a gentle smile. "Don't worry about him," he said in a low voice. "Dogs that bark that loudly rarely bite." He took a leather business card from his wallet. "Please, I want you to have this. It's not a business card. It's a promise of help. My driver is outside. He'll take you home safely. You must not, under any circumstances, take the subway tonight." Clara looked at the card, the name Dr. Arthur Sterling, embossed in gold foil. It felt like an object from another planet. She hesitated, a lifetime of refusal and self-reliance stopping her from accepting. I can't," she stammered. "Don't worry," he insisted. "To consider it a small payment for the millions of dollars you just saved me, I was about to authenticate that travesty." Clara finally nodded, exhaustion winning out over pride. As she walked beside Dr. Sterling toward the exit, they passed Edward. He turned slowly, his eyes like slits of ice. He ignored the expert and spoke directly to Clara, his voice once again low and hissing. "You can go with your new protector, but I'm going to find out everything about you. Every secret, every speck of dust under your rug. People like you with that kind of knowledge don't just appear out of nowhere cleaning floors. I'm going to find out what you're hiding. The threat was different now, deeper. It wasn't about revenge. It was about tearing apart her life, her past. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. There was, in fact, dust under her rug, a history she had worked hard to keep buried. As she stepped out into the cold night, the city lights had never seemed so menacing. Dr. Sterling's car was a sanctuary of silence and soft leather, gliding through the streets of New York like a ghost. For Clara, who had spent her adult life balancing on crowded city buses and subways, the experience was surreal. The streetlights passed by the tinted window like distant stars in an unknown galaxy. She felt out of place, a wrong piece in a game of luxury and power. Her work uniform seemed to scratch the impeccable upholstery, and she kept her hands, still faintly smelling of cleaning products, clasped tightly in her lap. The driver, a man in a suit and cap, didn't say a word, just followed the address she had provided in a whisper. A simple apartment complex in Astoria, Queens, an entire universe away from Chelsea. Edward's threat echoed in her mind, replaying like a scratched record. "And I'm going to find out what you're hiding." He was right. People like her didn't just appear out of nowhere. Her life was a tapestry woven with threads of knowledge and secrets, an inheritance from her father that was both a blessing and a curse. Upon arriving at her small apartment, the familiar smell of old books and lavender comforted her. The place was modest, but every object told a story. On the walls, instead of expensive paintings, were simple frames with reproductions of Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical studies and Dürer's botanical sketches. The main bookshelf, which took up an entire wall of the living room, held not novels or bestsellers, but dozens of auction catalogues, artist biographies, treatises on Renaissance pigmentation, and most importantly, the bound copies of her father's notebooks. She approached the shelf, her fingertips brushing against the worn spines. She opened one of the volumes, and the scent of old paper and fountain pen ink transported her to her childhood. She saw herself again, a girl with pigtails, sitting on the floor of her father's office at MoMA, surrounded by giants of art, while he, with a passion that bordered on obsession, taught her to distinguish a real Monet from a copy by the way the light hit the water, or a Rembrandt by the psychological depth in his subject's eyes. Her father, Richard, wasn't just a curator, he was a guardian. He believed art was the soul of humanity and that forgers were thieves of that soul. Julian Croft, the man whose signature she had recognized, was his greatest adversary, a genius of deception whose skill both fascinated and terrified him. Richard dedicated years of his life to tracking and documenting Croft's work, creating a meticulous archive of his techniques, his deliberate mistakes, his near-perfect signatures. And he had made Clara his sole apprentice. "Look, my daughter," he would say, pointing to a detail with a magnifying glass. "Croft can never capture the melancholy. The technique is perfect, but the soul is missing. It's like a beautiful, lifeless body." This education, so rich and privileged, was now her burden. After a scandal that destroyed her father's career, a false accusation of involvement in an art smuggling ring, they lost everything. The prestige, the friends, the financial stability. The wealth of knowledge he had given her couldn't be converted into capital to pay the bills. On the contrary, it became a painful reminder of a world to which she no longer belonged. She closed the book with a sigh, the dust of the past settling on her present. Edward's threat wasn't just about exposing some minor secret. It was about unearthing the pain and humiliation that drove her father to ruin and her to invisibility. She had become a cleaner not for lack of options, but by choice. It was a disguise, a refuge. No one looked at a cleaner. No one asked about her past. It was the perfect armor against a world that had hurt her deeply. That night, in the gallery, she had let her guard down for an instant, and the world, in the form of Edward Vance, had attacked. He was determined to dig, and she knew that if he dug deep enough, he wouldn't just find her father's story, but the real reason she was hiding, a secret about Julian Croft that not even her father had known, a secret that could shake the foundations of the art market far more devastatingly than the exposure of a single fake painting. The landline, an old rotary phone, rang, its shrill sound shattering the silence. Clara jumped. No one ever called that number. Her heart hammering against her ribs. She answered. On the other end of the line, a voice distorted by an electronic modulator said just 2 words, "Stay silent." The 2 words hung in the air, charged with a sinister electricity that made every hair on Clara's arm stand on end. Stay silent. The voice, robotic and devoid of any emotion, was more frightening than any shout. A click, and the line went dead. Clara stood with the receiver in her hand, the cold plastic against her ear, the dial tone humming like an ominous insect. Her first thought was Edward. This had his fingerprints all over it, a cruel intimidation tactic designed to terrify her into retreat. He wanted to bury the story, to silence the humiliating witness to his failure. But as the initial shock subsided, a nagging doubt began to form in her mind. Edward's threat in the gallery had been personal, direct, full of hot rage. This call, however, was different. It was cold, impersonal, anonymous. It felt like it came from a darker, more calculated place. Could there be someone else interested in her silence? Someone who didn't want the name Julian Croft circulating again? She hung up the phone, her hands trembling. The small apartment, once her refuge, suddenly felt vulnerable, the dark windows like eyes watching her from the night outside. She went to the living room window, peeking through a crack in the curtains. The street was deserted, lit only by the yellow glow of a single streetlight. No suspicious cars, no figures in the shadows. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The secret she kept about Croft, the detail her father never knew, suddenly felt far more dangerous. It was information she had discovered by chance, years after her father's death, while organizing his archives. Amid notes on pigments and canvas analysis, there was a small black notebook she had never seen before. Inside, in a hurried, almost illegible script, her father had documented his final suspicions. Croft wasn't just a forger. He was the guardian of something much larger. He was hiding original works of art, stolen by the Nazis during World War II and never recovered, replacing them with his brilliant copies on the market. He didn't create the forgeries for profit, but to protect the real works, waiting for the right moment to return them. This theory, if proven, would transform Croft from a notorious villain into an unlikely hero, a kind of secret guardian of art. And worse, it would imply that some of the most valuable works in private collections and even museums around the world could actually be Croft forgeries, while the originals were hidden somewhere. It was an atomic bomb for the art world, capable of destroying reputations, evaporating fortunes, and rewriting history. Her father's career had been destroyed by a false accusation of involvement with the black market. But what if he had actually been too close to discovering this truth? What if his ruin had been orchestrated by people who wanted this secret to remain buried? People far more powerful and dangerous than an arrogant billionaire like Edward Vance. The anonymous call now made terrifying sense. It wasn't about a single fake painting. It was about the entire house of cards that could collapse if she started talking. Suddenly, the figure of Dr. Sterling returned to her mind. He had seemed genuinely interested, a scholar in search of the truth. But he was also part of that world, a pillar of the establishment. Could he be an ally or part of the problem? He had helped her, driven her home. But what if his interest was just a way to control her? to find out how much she really knew before deciding what to do with her. Distrust, a survival instinct honed by years of isolation, wrapped around her like a cloak. She was alone. She couldn't trust Edward, the mysterious caller, and perhaps not even Dr. Sterling. The expert's business card lay on the coffee table. The gold embossing seemed to mock her. It was an invitation to a world that had spit her out once and now, for different reasons, wanted her back or silenced forever. Her knowledge, her father's inheritance, was the key, but she didn't know which door it opened and which one led to an abyss. The sound of soft footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment made her hold her breath. Someone stopped right in front of her door. The sound of a soft knock on the door, 3 polite taps, made Clara's heart leap into her throat. It wasn't the aggressive banging of the police or the hurried rap of a neighbor. It was measured, calm, which somehow made it even more menacing. She backed into the shadows of the living room, away from the sliver of hallway light that crept under the door. Instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, to pretend she wasn't there, to merge with the furniture and disappear. The anonymous call, the robotic voice, Edward's threat. It all coalesced into an overwhelming panic. Whoever was on the other side, it wasn't a friendly visit. She held her breath, hoping the footsteps would move on. Instead, the same knock sounded again, a little firmer this time. And then, a voice came through the wood of the door, a voice she recognized immediately, making her feel a conflicting wave of relief and suspicion. "Miss Almeida, it's Arthur Sterling. Please, open up. I need to speak with you." Why was he here? How did he get her address? The driver, of course. He had brought her home. But his presence here at this hour of the night felt like a violation, an invasion of her sanctuary. The distrust she'd felt earlier returned with full force. Was he the one behind the call? A good cop, bad cop tactic, where he offered help while his accomplices terrorized her. Hesitantly, she walked slowly to the door, the floorboards creaking under her feet. She kept the security chain in place and opened the door just a few inches. Dr. Sterling's face appeared in the gap, and the genuine concern in his eyes disarmed her slightly. He didn't look threatening. He looked tired, like an older man who should be at home, not on the doorstep of an apartment building in the outer boroughs. "I apologize for the late hour," he said, his voice low, "but I couldn't stop thinking. I was worried. Men like Edward Vance, when their egos are bruised, can be dangerous. They see everything as assets and liabilities, and you, right now, are a liability on his balance sheet." Clara said nothing, just watched him through the crack. "May I come in for a moment?" he asked. "I promise I won't be long." She hesitated, but something in his vulnerability convinced her. She closed the door, unlatched the chain, and opened it fully. Dr. Sterling stepped inside, and his gaze immediately swept the room, not with the curiosity of an intruder, but with the recognition of a pilgrim. His eyes fixed on the bookshelf, and a melancholy smile touched his lips. "It's exactly as I imagined," he whispered. "Richard's sanctuary." He turned to her, his eyes shining with a restrained emotion. "Clara, I wasn't entirely honest with you at the gallery. I knew your father very well. Richard wasn't just a colleague. He was my mentor at the start of my career. He taught me almost everything I know about the soul of art, not just its value in dollars." The revelation hit her like a wave. This man, a pillar of the world that had destroyed her father, was standing in her living room, claiming a connection that seemed impossible. Old anger and pain bubbled up inside her. "If you knew him so well," she said, her voice sharp. "Oh, where were you when his career was destroyed? Where were all his friends when he lost everything because of lies?" The grief in her voice was palpable. Dr. Sterling didn't flinch. He absorbed the accusation, his face contracting in an expression of deep regret. "You have every right to ask that," he said softly. "I was young, cowardly. I was one of those who stepped away, afraid the mud would splash onto me. It is the greatest regret of my life." He paused, his gaze returning to the bookshelf. "I came here tonight to ask for your forgiveness, but also to ask for your help. What you did today, it confirmed a suspicion your father and I had for years, a dangerous suspicion." He took a step toward the books, as if drawn by a magnet. His finger traced the spine of one of the bound volumes. "I see you've kept all his research." His gaze met hers, intense and piercing. "Especially the little black notebook." Clara's world stopped spinning. The words, "the little black notebook," left Dr. Sterling's lips and struck the center of her being with the force of an earthquake. It was impossible. No one, absolutely no one, knew of that journal's existence. It was her father's deepest secret, the repository of his most dangerous and unorthodox theories, thoughts he never dared record in his official museum documents. She had found it by chance, tucked inside a hollowed-out book years after his death. It was her most intimate inheritance, a silent, exclusive link to the mind of the man who raised her. And now this stranger, this ghost of a regretful past, was in her living room, speaking of the notebook as if it were a matter of fact. The air grew thin in her lungs. The room, once a refuge, seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on her. The ringing in her ears was louder than the traffic outside. How could he possibly know? The question echoed in her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. "How?" she whispered, the only word she could form. The earlier anger dissipated, replaced by a cold fear and overwhelming confusion. Dr. Sterling seemed to understand the turmoil in her eyes. He didn't move closer, maintaining a respectful distance. "Your father told me about it," he explained, his voice heavy with an old sorrow. "A week before everything fell apart, he called me late at night. He was agitated, excited and terrified all at once. He said he'd made a breakthrough, something that would change how we saw art history, that could return priceless treasures to their rightful owners. He said Julian Croft wasn't the villain everyone thought he was." The confirmation of her father's theory, coming from someone else, was a shock. It was real, not just the delusion of a broken man. "He told me he was recording everything in a little black notebook," Sterling continued, "and that he would show me the following week, but he never got the chance. The accusation came, the scandal erupted, and he shut himself off from the world. He shut me out." The image of her father in his last years, bitter and reclusive, flooded Clara's mind. That vibrant, passionate man who saw the world's soul on canvas. Reduced to a shadow of himself, the injustice of it suffocated her. "And what did you do?" she asked, her voice trembling but with a thread of steel. "You knew he was innocent. You knew he was close to something monumental, and you left him alone." "Yes," Sterling said, not looking away, accepting the full weight of his guilt. "I did. I was a coward, and I have lived with that shame every single day of my life." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But I never stopped looking. Quietly, over the years, I followed the clues he gave me in that phone call. I investigated auctions, questionable provenances, private collection asset sales, and today, when you identified that signature with such certainty, I knew Richard's legacy wasn't dead, it was alive in you." A heavy silence settled between them. Clara felt exposed, as if he had read not just the notebook, but her very soul. The solitude that had defined her for so long was cracked. There was someone else in the world who knew her secret. The question was whether this person was a bridge to justice or a trap. He watched her, and she saw in his eyes not pity, but a kind of plea. He wasn't just here to apologize, he needed her. "The painting in Edward's gallery," he said, his voice low and urgent. "That wasn't a coincidence, Clara. The appearance of that specific work, in that place, at that moment, it was a signal. In the world your father was investigating, nothing is a coincidence. And you, By exposing the fake didn't just humiliate a billionaire, you answered the signal. You just told a very powerful and very dangerous group of people that Richard Almeida's research is still alive. Dr. Sterling's sentence hung in the room, laden with a weight that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the air. You just told a very powerful and very dangerous group of people that Richard Almeida's research is still alive. This was no longer about Edward Vance's humiliation, a fake painting, or her father's reputation. It was about a silent war that had spanned decades, and which, tonight, had drafted her onto the front lines. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The instinct that had kept her safe for so long screamed for her to pull back, deny everything, throw him out of her apartment, and reinforce the locks on her anonymity. Trust was a currency she no longer had to spend. "Why should I believe you?" she questioned, her voice low but firm, the armor of distrust reassembling around her heart. "You show up at my door, years after the fact, talking about secret notebooks and conspiracies. How do I know this isn't a trap? How do I know you're not working for them?" Dr. Sterling didn't seem offended. He nodded, as if expecting exactly this reaction. "Because cowardice has an expiration date, Clara, and mine expired a long time ago," he said, the sincerity in his voice almost painful. "You're not dealing with a single man like Edward Vance. He's just a small, loud fish. We're talking about a consortium, a network of individuals whose combined wealth would dwarf the treasury of nations. They don't see art the way we do. To them, a Rothko or a de Kooning is no different from tech stocks or a crypto portfolio. It's just another asset, a way to diversify their holdings, to move capital across borders without leaving a trail." He took a step closer, his expression serious. "They control auction houses, have curators on their payroll, and use these hidden masterpieces as collateral for multi-billion-dollar deals. Your father's research didn't just threaten to expose the fraud, it threatened to destabilize the cash flow of an empire." He realized that words, no matter how true, weren't enough. She needed proof, something tangible that would connect him to her through the only person she had ever fully trusted. "Your father and I had a code," Sterling said softly, "a test of trust." He suspected that the Portrait of a Girl by Modigliani, which officially belongs to a Swiss billionaire, was actually a Croft copy. "I was in Europe for a conference, and, using my credentials, I managed to get access to pigment reports on the work. There was an anomaly, a trace of titanium white that Modigliani never used in that period. I phoned your father and said only one sentence: 'The sky in Paris is bluer than you remember.' He understood. He jotted down that confirmation, along with the data I gave him. On page 42 of the black notebook, please, Clara, check." The challenge was laid down. It was specific, detailed, impossible to invent. Clara felt the floor beneath her feet sway. That detail was so obscure, so particular, that only someone who had truly been in communication with her father could know it. She stood in silence, her heart pounding, her mind a storm of doubt and hope. Sterling understood that pressing her would be a mistake. He backed toward the door. "I won't force you into anything," he said. "The decision is yours, but they know you exist now. Staying put may be just as dangerous as acting." He took a pen from his pocket and wrote something on a small slip of paper. "Don't call me. It's too risky. When you're ready, if you're ready, go to the main branch of the New York Public Library. Ask for this book." He handed her the paper. "Leave any kind of bookmark on page 42. I'll know." He opened the door and left, leaving her alone in the deafening silence. For a long time, she didn't move. Then, like an automaton, she walked to the bookshelf, her heart thrumming in her ears. She located the bound volume that contained the black notebook. With trembling hands, she opened it to page 42. There it was, the note about the Modigliani, Portrait of a Girl, and, beside it, the phrase, "The sky in Paris is bluer." But tucked between that page and the next was something she had never noticed before. A small, faded photograph. In it, a younger, smiling Richard stood, arm over the shoulder of an equally young Arthur Sterling. And next to them, laughing like an old friend, was a third man she recognized instantly from dozens of newspaper clippings, Julian Croft himself. The small photograph, a paper ghost yellowed with age, seemed to burn Clara's fingertips. The world she knew, built on the solid foundation of her father's memory as a martyr for integrity, cracked and disintegrated in that instant. There he was, Richard Almeida, the man who taught her that truth in art was sacred, with his arm around the shoulders of the man he defined as the arch-heretic, Julian Croft, and beside them, the unlikely link, Arthur Sterling. It wasn't a photograph of adversaries, of an arrest or a confrontation. The body language was unmistakable. It was an image of camaraderie, of secrets shared under a sun Clara couldn't place. The pain that hit her was sharp and unexpected, a betrayal that traveled through time. Had her father's life been a lie, all his devotion, his obsession, his ruin, had it all been part of a charade he himself had helped build? She sank into the nearest armchair, the photograph still in her hand, her heart beating erratically. The memories came in a whirlwind. The nights her father came home late from the museum, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a frustration she now saw in a new light. It wasn't just the fight against forgers. It was the strain of a double life, the paranoia that consumed him in his final years, the distrust of everyone and everything. It wasn't madness. It was the justified fear of a man who knew too much, who was involved in a dangerous game with astronomical sums at stake. The immense wealth Sterling had described, an ocean of dark money disguised as cultural heritage, was the monster her father was fighting from the inside. He wasn't a hypocrite. He was a soldier embedded in enemy territory. The revelation settled in her soul, not as a betrayal, but as a painful epiphany. She finally understood. Her father's downfall wasn't an accident or a random injustice. It was a surgical elimination. He got too close to the heart of the empire, threatened to expose not just the fake assets, but the entire structure of their cash flow. They didn't just discredit him, they silenced him in the cruelest way possible by destroying the one thing he valued more than life itself, his reputation. The inheritance he left her wasn't property or stocks. It was that little black notebook and the explosive truth it contained. It was a weapon, and he had entrusted it to her. For years, she had treated it as a relic of pain, a memorial to a past best left buried. Now, she saw it was a map, a call to action she had been too blind to see. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. The anonymous call, Edward's threat, the feeling of being watched. It was all real. But now, the fear was accompanied by a new feeling, anger, a righteous, inherited anger that burned through the fog of apathy that had enveloped her for so long. They had taken her father from her. They had stolen his name, his joy, his final years. They had forced her into a life in the shadows, and she would not allow it anymore. Her father's memory would not be defined by the lie his enemies created. Dr. Sterling, for all his past cowardice, was offering her a chance to rewrite the end of that story. It was a monumental risk, a gamble against people who would not hesitate to crush her. But the alternative, to continue living as a shadow, had suddenly become unbearable. With a determination she hadn't felt in decades, Clara stood up. She placed the photograph back, with reverent care, inside the black notebook. It was a treasure, the proof of a secret alliance for the soul of art. She looked at the paper where Sterling had written the name of the book and the location, New York Public Library. A public place, safe, a smart move. She walked to her small bedroom and changed out of her work uniform into simple slacks and a dark coat. For the first time in years, she wasn't dressing to be invisible. She was dressing for battle. As she picked up her keys from the table by the door, she paused. She looked around the apartment, her cocoon, her hiding place. She knew that once she crossed that threshold, nothing would ever be the same. With a deep breath, she turned the key in the lock and stepped out into the night, feeling the eyes of the city on her, not knowing which were friendly and which were hostile. The city at night was a predator of light and shadow, and for the first time, Clara felt like the prey. The subway ride to Midtown Manhattan, a routine she had performed in a state of semi-anonymity for years, transformed into an exercise in paranoia. Every passenger who got on, every face reflected in the dark glass of the window, was a potential observer. She saw a threat in the eyes of a man reading a newspaper, in the earbuds of a young student, in the way a car driver looked for too long at the train as it rattled over the bridge. She, who had mastered the art of being invisible, now felt naked under a relentless spotlight. The knowledge she carried was a heavy burden, a kind of wealth that didn't buy security but stole it. She understood now that the vast fortune of her enemies wasn't just measured in money or assets, but in power, in eyes and ears scattered throughout the city. A surveillance network funded by endless capital. As she emerged into the cold night air at 42nd Street, the New York Public Library rose before her, majestic and silent, a temple of knowledge in the concrete jungle. To many, it was just an old building. To Clara, it was sacred territory. One of the last places she had felt the vibrant presence of her father. He used to bring her here as a child, and while he lost himself in research, she would venture through the stacks, inhaling the scent of paper and history. True wealth, he would say, wasn't in bank vaults, but bound on these shelves. Entering the library was like stepping back in time. The reverent silence, the gentle creak of the wooden floors, the soft light bathing the long reading tables. It was all familiar, but the familiarity was tinged with danger. Every step was calculated. She was no longer a curator's daughter on an outing, but an operative on a secret mission. She walked to the information desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She requested the book Dr. Sterling had noted, Studies in Chromatic Symbolism of the Tuscan Renaissance. In the most neutral voice she could muster, the librarian, a man with thick glasses, barely looked up, just stamped a form and pointed toward a section. With the book in hand, a heavy, obscure tome, she sought an isolated spot, a small desk in a corner from which she could observe most of the hall without being easily seen. She opened the volume, the pages smelling of dust and time. For a moment, she hesitated. This was the point of no return. By placing the bookmark, she would be activating a mechanism whose workings she didn't know, declaring her allegiance in a war she barely understood. She thought of her father, of his courage and his ruin. She thought of the photograph, of that unlikely alliance for the soul of art. With trembling fingers, she took the used subway metro card she had kept in her pocket, a bookmark from her world, not his, and slid it delicately between pages 42 and 43. Mission accomplished. Clara closed the book and got up to return it, feeling a mix of terror and relief. As she walked back to the counter, a young woman, who couldn't have been more than 25, stood up from a nearby table and walked toward her. Their eyes met for an instant. The woman gave her a discreet smile and, as she passed, accidentally dropped a small, folded tissue on the floor. Before Clara could react or say anything, the young woman bent down, picked up the paper, and held it out to her. "You dropped this, ma'am," she said in a nearly inaudible whisper, her eyes conveying an urgency that contradicted the banality of her words. Clara, confused, took the paper. It felt too heavy to be a tissue. The young woman walked away quickly, blending in with the other patrons and disappearing between the stacks. Her heart racing, Clara unfolded the small paper. Inside, tightly rolled, was a small metal key and a note with a single sentence. written in a hurried script. It wasn't from Sterling. The sentence read, "They know about the library. Your apartment is no longer safe. Go to locker 1 to 12 at Port Authority. Now." The paper in Clara's hand felt like it weighed a ton, the small metal key cold against her skin. The sacred silence of the library suddenly became oppressive, the tall bookshelves transforming into the bars of a closing cage. They know about the library. The message was a blaring alarm in her mind. Sterling's plan, so careful and discreet, had been compromised, or the thought hit her with the force of a punch. It was never a safe plan to begin with. Had he led her into a trap? Was the young woman sent by him in a desperate act to fix a mistake, or by the enemy to divert her into even greater danger? There was no time to analyze. There was only the raw urgency in the note's handwriting. Now! With a monumental effort, she forced her muscles to move. She returned the heavy book to the desk, her mind racing, trying to appear calm, normal, just another patron. Every glance in her direction felt like a knife in her back. She walked out into the cold of Bryant Park, the noise of the city engulfing her like a wave. Her apartment was no longer safe. The phrase echoed, pulling the ground from under her. Her sanctuary, her refuge built over years of silence, had been breached. The thought of going back there, of finding a broken door or, say worse, someone waiting for her in the shadows, was paralyzing. She was adrift, with no anchor and no port. Port Authority, that's where the message sent her. A place of chaos, of perpetual motion, the pulsing, anonymous heart of the city. Perhaps it was the only place a woman alone could vanish into the crowd. She got on the first bus, heading in the right direction, paying the fare with the few bills she had. She sat in the back, huddled against the window, watching the city lights blur past. She felt absurdly small, an ant trying to fight giants. They had incalculable wealth, a net worth that spanned continents, dealing in cryptocurrency and investment funds that moved more money in a day than she would see in 1,000 lifetimes. And her, she had a key to a locker. The Port Authority bus terminal greeted her with its cacophonous symphony of departure announcements, the rattle of suitcase wheels and the buzz of 1,000 conversations. The smell of metal, coffee, and exhaustion hung in the air. For a moment, the vastness of the place overwhelmed her. But then she remembered. Here, she was invisible again. Not the cleaner, not the heir to a dangerous secret, just another face in the crowd. She followed the signs to the baggage lockers, her heart beating in time with her quickening steps. She found the section, a wall of cold metal under the harsh, impersonal light of fluorescent bulbs. Number 112 was on the bottom row, inconspicuous. She looked around. No one seemed to be paying her any attention. With a trembling hand, she inserted the key into the lock. It turned. The metallic click sounded extraordinarily loud in her ears. She pulled open the small door, the still air from inside the locker touching her face. Inside, there was a simple, unmarked cloth bag, her heart in her throat. She grabbed it and moved away quickly, seeking the relative anonymity of an empty bench in a less crowded corner. Her hands shook so badly she could barely open the zipper. Inside, she found a simple, older cell phone, the kind that only makes calls and sends texts, a disposable burner phone. There was also a small wad of $50 bills, enough cash for a few days, no more, and underneath it all, a manila envelope. She opened it. Inside, there was no letter or instructions. There was only a single black and white photograph, small and with worn edges. The image made her hold her breath. It was her mother, young, smiling, her hair swept up in an elegant bun, unmistakably her. But it wasn't her mother's face that shocked her. It was the setting. She was standing in a European square, in front of a museum Clara instantly recognized as the Louvre in Paris. And beside her, his hand lightly touching her arm, with a look of admiration and complicity, was a young and smiling Julian Croft. The air in the bus terminal, heavy and anonymous, seemed to solidify in Clara's lungs. The photograph was an impossibility, a temporal anomaly that rewrote every memory she had of her mother, Laura. Her mother had always been the anchor of normalcy in her life, the gentle, quiet presence who mended her father's shirts, who made tea to calm his sleepless nights, who maintained the small apartment as a refuge from the obsession that consumed her husband. She was the safe harbor, the silent victim of that war, the woman whose heart broke along with her husband's career, or so Clara had believed. The woman in the photograph, however, was no victim. There was a confidence in her smile, a light of intelligence in her eyes as she looked at Julian Croft. His hand on her arm was not a gesture of control, but of partnership. They were accomplices, and suddenly, fragments of memory, previously meaningless, snapped into place with painful clarity. The trips to visit her sick aunt in Europe, from which her mother returned more tired but with a strange glint in her eye. The whispered conversations with her father behind closed doors, the wooden crates of art catalogues that arrived from unknown senders. Her mother was not a soldier's wife. She was the other soldier. If her father was the intelligence, the brains of the operation hunting the truth about Croft and the corrupt network, her mother was the field agent, the diplomat, the direct contact. Her father's inheritance was the research, the knowledge. Her mother's was the risk, the action. The revelation was so profound, so seismic, it left her breathless. She wasn't just continuing her father's work. She was following in both her parents' footsteps, a legacy of silent courage she never knew existed. The pain of not having known the real woman who raised her was overwhelming, a wave of grief for a person who had been by her side her whole life, yet remained a mystery. She finally understood the depth of their sacrifice, the magnitude of the moral fortune they were trying to protect. In that moment of epiphany and pain, the burner phone in the bag buzzed, the harsh vibrations startling her. With hands still trembling, she answered. The voice on the other end was not Sterling's. It was the soft, controlled voice of the young woman from the library. "There isn't much time," the woman said without preamble. "Doctor, Sterling is being watched. They used him as bait to get to you. The signal at the library was intercepted." Clara felt her blood run cold. "Who are you?" she whispered. "My name doesn't matter," the voice replied. "I am Julian Croft's granddaughter. My grandfather and your parents began a mission more than 50 years ago, to recover the works that were stolen and replaced, and to expose the consortium that has profited from this fraud for generations. Your father's notebook contains the research. Your mother's journals, which my grandfather kept safe, contain the locations. Together, they are the key to dismantling everything. Croft's granddaughter, a living link to that secret past." "Why now?" Clara asked. "Because they're moving one of the most important pieces, a lost Mark Rothko that everyone believes was destroyed in a fire. The fake is on display in a museum in Miami, but the real one will be used as collateral in a cryptocurrency transaction in less than 24 hours. It's our only chance to expose the scheme with irrefutable proof." The young woman's voice grew more intense. "Your parents gave their lives for this, Clara. My family has lived in the shadows to protect this secret. Now, the choice is yours. In the bag, there's a bus ticket to Miami that leaves in 1 hour, and an address. I'll be waiting for you. Or you can take the money, throw away the phone, and disappear. No one would blame you, but their life's work will die forever." The choice, presented so starkly by Croft's granddaughter, echoed in the bus terminal, overriding the noise of departures and arrivals. On one side, the promise of anonymity, an exit to a quiet life, far from shadows and danger. The money in the bag was an invitation to vanish, to resume the invisibility that had protected her for so long. On the other, the legacy of her parents, a truth so monumental they had sacrificed everything to protect it. It wasn't about revenge, Clara realized, but about justice. It wasn't about punishing the wealthy men who destroyed her family, but about restoring the truth, about returning the soul to the art they had turned into mere financial assets. The image of her mother in Paris, brave and determined, superimposed itself on the memory of her father, hunched over his books. They were not victims, they were warriors, and she was their daughter. In that moment, under the cold lights of the bus station, Clara knew there was no choice. There was only one path forward. The trip to Miami was a long night of reflection, the darkness of the highway serving as a canvas for her thoughts. Every mile took her further from her old life and closer to an uncertain destiny. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was now counterbalanced by a sense of purpose she had never felt before. She was no longer running. She was moving towards something. Arriving in the sun-drenched city as the first rays of light gilded the skyline, she followed the instructions. The address led her to a small, discreet art restoration studio in Wynwood. The young woman who met her at the door was exactly like her voice on the phone, calm, focused, and with an intensity that belied her age. She introduced herself as Lucia. The studio was a sanctuary, filled with the scent of turpentine and linseed oil, and on an easel, covered by a cloth, was the reason for everything. Lucia revealed that Sterling's plan wasn't a trap, but an act of desperation. He knew he was being watched and used the library rendezvous as a diversion so Lucia's team could contact Clara safely. He was, at that very moment, risking his own safety to buy them time. My grandfather and your parents built a network, Lucia explained, as she unveiled the real plan. A network of historians, restorers, even drivers for art transport companies, people who believe that capital can't buy history. The plan was audacious and precise. They weren't going to steal the painting, they were going to swap it. Lucia had spent years creating a perfect copy of her grandfather's forgery. A forgery of the forgery. With the help of a museum security guard, a man whose family Richard had helped in the past, they would switch the works during the nightly transfer to the vault. The real Rothko would be safe, and the copy of the copy would travel to the transaction. When the buyers discovered they'd been duped with a historically worthless fake, panic would set in, forcing an audit and exposing the entire fraud. The execution was almost unbearably tense. Clara, wearing a restorer's lab coat, played a crucial role. Her encyclopedic knowledge, her father's legacy, was used to verify every detail of the transfer documentation, identifying a flaw in the security protocol that created the window of opportunity they needed. While Lucia and the guard performed the switch behind the scenes, Clara distracted the chief curator, a man on the consortium's payroll, with technical questions about the painting's pigmentation, a debate so specific and erudite that it pinned him down for precious minutes. In that moment, she wasn't a janitor. She was Richard Almeida's daughter, wielding knowledge like a sword. By dawn, the swap was complete. The real masterpiece was secure, and the time bomb was on its way to explode in the heart of her enemy's financial empire. Back at the studio, Lucia handed Clara a passport with a new name and a plane ticket. "My grandfather set up a fund for this," she said. "A small portion of the profits he made selling his own works, not the forgeries. An inheritance to protect the guardians." Clara looked at Lucia, the young woman who carried the weight of generations on her shoulders. In them, the legacy of their parents and grandparents was alive. "And you?" Clara asked. "I'm staying," Lucia replied, with a determined smile. "The work isn't done. This was just the first piece to be returned. Now, we have to find the others." Clara nodded, a deep understanding passing between them. She took the documents. The work of her previous life was over. A new journey was about to begin. The days following the audacious museum swap were a blur of urgent news reports and tense silences. From a safe house in a small town in Tuscany, the same place that had inspired Julian Croft decades ago, Clara and Lucia Connected by a secure line, watched the shockwaves spread across the globe. The news broke first, not in the art columns, but in the business sections. A cryptocurrency deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars had collapsed. Rumors of fraud, of false collateral, spread like wildfire. The name Edward Vance, the billionaire humiliated in the gallery, resurfaced, linked to a network of panicked investors. Lucia's forgery of a forgery had worked perfectly. By presenting a copy with no historical value, they had exposed not only the absence of the real artwork, but the fragility of an empire built on secrets and lies. The ensuing audit was inevitable and devastating. Curators were fired, reputations destroyed, and the art market entered a period of unprecedented scrutiny. Dr. Sterling, unharmed, emerged as the voice of reason amid the chaos. He used his platform to speak not only of the fraud, but of the need for transparency and, more importantly, to begin the process of rehabilitating Richard Almeida's name. He presented the theory of the little black notebook to the world, not as an accusation, but as a fascinating new line of historical inquiry, transforming Richard from a pariah into a misunderstood pioneer. The story of Julian Croft was rewritten, from a master of deception to a complex guardian of art, a thief who stole from thieves. The consortium, exposed and weakened, retreated into the shadows, its members too busy trying to save their own fortunes to continue the hunt. The war wasn't over, but the most important battle had been won. On a sunny morning, with the scent of cypress and damp earth in the air, Clara sat on the terrace of her small house, reading a letter. It was from Lucia. The real Mark Rothko had been anonymously discovered and returned to the American people, now displayed in a public museum for all to see. It was the first of many planned returns. At the end of the letter, Lucia wrote that she had established the Almeida Croft Foundation, an institution dedicated to using cutting-edge technology to trace the provenance of artworks and combat the use of art for money laundering. The legacy of their parents and grandfather was no longer a whispered secret, but a beacon. Clara folded the letter with a smile. The fear that had accompanied her for so long had vanished, replaced by a profound peace. She no longer needed to hide. The knowledge that was once her burden was now her strength. She spent her days translating her mother's journals and her father's notebooks, organizing the vast archive they had created, preparing the material for the foundation. She was no longer Clara the cleaner. She was Clara Almeida, guardian of a legacy, a historian in her own right. The wealth she now possessed couldn't be measured in dollars or Bitcoin, but in the richness of restored truth, in the fortune of a found purpose. She looked out at the Tuscan hills, so beloved by her mother and by Croft, and felt their presence, not as ghosts of a painful past, but as companions on her journey. Overcoming wasn't about forgetting the pain, but transforming it into strength, honoring her parents, a sacrifice by continuing their work. Justice, she had learned, was not a single, explosive event, but a slow, meticulous process, like the restoration of an old painting, removing the layers of dirt and lies to reveal the beauty and truth beneath. And in that beauty, in that purpose, she found not only her family's redemption, but her own.